Daystar Television Network has died. The network shared on social media that Joni Lamb passed away this morning.
The final months of Joni Lamb's life were surrounded by something unusual: silence. Viewers noticed changes. Rumors spread. Public appearances became less frequent. Yet very little was said about what was happening behind the scenes. Then, on May 7, 2026, the co-founder of one of the world's largest Christian television networks was gone. A back injury was cited. Serious health challenges were acknowledged, but many questions remained unanswered. At the same time, Daystar was already facing family disputes, public allegations, leadership uncertainty, and growing pressure from critics. Was Joni Lamb's death simply the end of a remarkable life? Or was it the beginning of a much larger story about power, succession, and the future of Daystar itself? Because what happened next may determine how her entire legacy is remembered. See this with your own eyes. Drop where you're watching from below and stick around with us. There's a lot more coming that you won't want to miss. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's continue. In the days after Joni Lamb's passing, Daystar released a statement expressing grief and honoring her decades of ministry. The announcement described her as a woman of faith, a visionary leader, and a driving force behind the network's global growth. But for many viewers, one detail stood out. The statement never fully explained what caused her death. What the public did learn was that Joni had recently suffered a serious back injury involving fractures near the junction of her upper and lower spine. Medical experts often describe injuries in this area as painful and difficult to recover from, especially for someone already dealing with other health challenges. That explanation seemed straightforward at first, but the more closely people looked, the more questions emerged. Family members acknowledged that Joni had been facing additional health struggles before the injury, yet those conditions were never publicly identified. Supporters who had followed her ministry for years began wondering whether the spinal injury was the primary cause of her decline, or merely the final complication in a much larger battle. The uncertainty only deepened because of what viewers had observed in the months leading up to her death. Some noticed physical changes during her occasional appearances. Others pointed to periods of abscess that seemed unusual for someone who had spent decades as one of Daystar's most visible leaders. The official explanation answered part of the story, but not all of it. And that gap between what was known and what remained hidden created a cloud of mystery that refused to disappear. Yet as questions about Joni's health continued to spread, another timeline began drawing attention, because some viewers believed the warning signs may have started much earlier than anyone realized. Long before the public began asking questions about Joni Lamb's death, some viewers believed they had already noticed signs that something was changing. At first, the changes were subtle: a missed appearance here, a shorter segment there. Nothing that seemed alarming on its own. But over time, a pattern began to emerge. For decades, Joni had been one of the most recognizable faces on Daystar. Her presence was constant. Whether hosting programs, interviewing guests, or speaking directly to viewers, she remained at the center of the network's public identity. That is why her reduced visibility caught people's attention. Some longtime supporters noticed that appearances seemed less frequent. Others pointed to moments when she appeared physically different than they remembered. Discussions quietly surfaced online as viewers compared recent broadcasts with appearances from previous years. None of these observations proved anything, yet they fueled speculation. The back injury eventually provided part of an explanation. Reports indicated that the fractures affected a particularly vulnerable area of the spine. Recovery could be long and difficult, even for healthy individuals. But there was another issue. Public statements suggested that the injury was only one factor among several serious health challenges. Those additional challenges were never fully explained. That silence became a story of its own. The more information remained private, the more supporters tried to fill in the gaps themselves. Some wondered whether Joni had been battling an illness for years. Others questioned whether leadership at Daystar had intentionally kept details confidential. The answers remained out of reach. But while attention focused on Joni's health, another crisis was quietly unfolding behind the scenes, one that involved family, leadership, and a growing conflict that threatened the future of the ministry itself. As questions about Joni Lamb's health continued to circulate, another story was unfolding behind closed doors. This one wasn't about illness. It was about family. And for many observers, it raised an uncomfortable possibility. What if the future of Daystar had been in dispute long before Joni's passing? For years, Daystar had been closely associated with the Lamb family. After the death of Marcus Lamb in 2021, many assumed leadership would eventually remain in the next generation. But exactly how that transition would happen was never entirely clear. Then, tensions began spilling into public view. Joni's relationship with her eldest son, Jonathan Lamb, deteriorated in a way few supporters expected. Once considered an important part of Daystar's future, Jonathan eventually found himself separated from the organization his parents had spent decades building. The conflict soon moved beyond private disagreements. Jonathan and his wife Susie publicly raised serious allegations involving family matters and Daystar leadership. The claims generated intense debate among supporters, critics, and Christian media observers. Investigations followed. Public statements were issued. Both sides firmly defended their positions. Yet, even after official inquiries concluded, the controversy refused to disappear. The dispute exposed something larger than a family disagreement. It exposed a struggle over trust. Supporters suddenly found themselves asking difficult questions. Was this simply a painful family conflict, or was it evidence of deeper problems inside one of the most influential Christian broadcasting organizations in the world? The timing only made those questions harder to ignore. As leadership disagreements intensified, another figure was becoming increasingly prominent within Joni's personal and professional life, and his arrival would trigger an entirely new wave of controversy. As the conflict within the Lamb family became increasingly public, another development was drawing attention across the ministry. It began with a marriage. After the death of Marcus Lamb in 2021, Joni faced one of the most difficult periods of her life. Supporters watched as she navigated grief while continuing to lead a global Christian network. Then, in 2023, Joni married Doug Weiss. Publicly, the relationship was presented as a story of healing, faith, and a new beginning. Doug quickly became a familiar face alongside Joni on Daystar programming, placing him near the center of the ministry's public image. But not everyone welcomed the change. Critics questioned how quickly the relationship had developed after Marcus's death. Others focused on Doug's professional history, which had already attracted scrutiny years before he joined Daystar in such a visible role. Reports highlighted past disciplinary actions involving professional licensing matters. Former clients also raised concerns about their experiences with counseling programs connected to him. While supporters defended Doug and viewed the criticism as unfair attacks, the controversies continued generating debate. The situation became even more complicated because of timing. As family tensions grew, Doug's influence appeared to be increasing. That led some observers to ask a question that Daystar never fully addressed. How much influence did Doug Weiss actually have within the organization? Was he simply Joni's husband and co-host, or was he becoming one of the most powerful voices behind the scenes? No clear answer emerged. Yet the discussion around Doug revealed something larger than one controversial figure. It revealed growing uncertainty about who truly held influence inside Daystar, and that uncertainty would soon collide with a much bigger problem. Because while leadership questions were mounting internally, the ministry itself was beginning to face pressure from the outside. For years, Daystar appeared to be one of the strongest forces in Christian broadcasting. From the outside, the network looked stable. Its programs reached audiences across the globe. Its influence stretched far beyond the United States, and its founders had spent decades building a ministry that became one of the largest Christian television networks in the world. But as controversies surrounding the Lamb family intensified, cracks began appearing in places few viewers expected. One of the biggest warning signs came from Daystar's relationships with other ministry leaders. Several prominent Christian broadcasters and ministries reportedly chose not to renew their partnerships with the network. Daystar maintained that many of these departures were routine business decisions. Critics, however, believed the timing raised difficult questions. Why were so many well-known names distancing themselves at the same moment? The controversy soon expanded beyond personal disputes and into broader concerns about governance, accountability, and transparency. For years, some critics had questioned how much information the public actually knew about Daystar's operations. Because of its organizational structure, many financial details remained outside the level of public disclosure expected from other nonprofit organizations. Those concerns became louder as the scandals unfolded. Supporters who had faithfully donated for years wanted reassurance. Critics demanded greater transparency, and industry observers began asking whether Daystar's leadership model was prepared to survive a major transition. The pressure was no longer focused on one family. It was focused on the future of the entire ministry. Then came the event that changed everything. Joanie Lamb's death transformed existing concerns into an urgent question that could no longer be avoided. Because with the network's most recognizable leader gone, everyone wanted to know the same thing. For all the questions surrounding Joni Lamb's health, family conflicts, and public controversies, one mystery continued to overshadow everything else. Who would lead Daystar after her death? At first, the network attempted to reassure viewers. An official statement confirmed that ministry operations would continue under an executive leadership team. Programs remained on the air. Daystar's global broadcasting network continued functioning without interruption. But there was one problem. Very little was said about who was actually making the biggest decisions. That silence created a new wave of speculation. Many observers immediately focused on Rachel Lamb Brown. For years, Rachel had been one of the most visible members of the next generation. Long before Joni's passing, she had developed a strong on-air presence and become increasingly involved in the ministry. Following her mother's passing, her role appeared to expand even further. To some supporters, Rachel seemed like the natural successor, but succession inside Daystar was never that simple. Questions also surrounded the network's board structure and governance. Unlike a family business where leadership automatically passes to a relative, Daystar's future would likely depend on decisions made behind closed doors by individuals largely unknown to the public. Then there was Doug Weiss. Although not a member of the founding Lamb family, his growing visibility during Joni's final years made him impossible to ignore. Supporters viewed him as a trusted partner. Critics worried about how much influence he might ultimately wield. And another possibility remained: Jonathan Lamb. Despite years of public conflict and estrangement, some supporters wondered whether reconciliation was still possible. Could the son, once expected by many to help lead Daystar, ever return? No definitive answer emerged, and that uncertainty revealed something important. The battle over Daystar's future was also becoming a battle over Joni Lamb's legacy itself. Joni Lamb's story is difficult to place into a single category. To some, she was a pioneer who helped build one of the most influential Christian media organizations in the world. Alongside Marcus Lamb, she transformed a small ministry into a global network that reached audiences across continents and brought faith-based programming into millions of homes. That achievement is undeniable, but legacies are rarely defined by achievements alone. In the final years of her life, Joni found herself at the center of challenges few could have predicted. Questions about her health remained largely private, family relationships fractured in public view, leadership disputes spilled into headlines, and controversies surrounding Daystar forced supporters and critics alike to examine the ministry more closely than ever. That is perhaps why her death sparked so much attention. It was not simply the loss of a well-known broadcaster. It was the loss of a leader whose departure exposed questions that had been building for years. Questions about transparency, questions about succession, questions about trust. Today, Daystar stands at a crossroads. Rachel Lamb Brown's growing visibility suggests one possible future. The executive leadership team suggests another. The board's decisions may ultimately determine the path forward. Even the possibility of future reconciliation within the Lamb family remains an unanswered chapter. For now, the network continues broadcasting. The programs continue. The ministry continues. But the uncertainty remains. Because the story was never only about what caused Joni Lamb's death. It was also about what her death revealed. And as Daystar moves into a new era, one question still hangs over everything. Who will ultimately shape the future of the ministries she spent decades building? The answer may already be taking shape behind closed doors. But until that future becomes clear, the biggest chapter of this story may still be unwritten.